Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope coming to you once again this week from Houston in Texas. We're going to start off today's show by discussing U.S.-Iran relations, and of course, those are always on slide down. There's been a sharp buildup of American combat power in the Persian Gulf region, in the region specifically around, of course, Iran itself, and this has been happening for a number of weeks now. Experts fear, obviously, that this growing militarization does mean that there may very well be some sort of conflict around the corner, but we've been here in the past. I mean, experts have always thought that there would be conflict between the U.S. and Iran, especially in that region itself, especially since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, on Iraqi soil and the ensuing Iranian retaliation as well. Is the U.S. seeking to, in some ways, rein in Iran? Because that has always been the U.S. concern, hasn't it? Regional activities of the Iranians and as well as global activities, really, also. What exactly is the game plan? Is the U.S. seeking or looking for war at this time, especially before Donald Trump leaves office and hands over power to Joe Biden? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Eric Bronner, who is the co-director of the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue. He's also a distinguished professor emeritus of political science at Rutgers University. He's joining us this morning from Fort Lee, New Jersey. Joining us this morning from Miami, Florida, is Dr. Eric Loeb, who is an associate professor of politics and international relations at Florida International University. And also joining us this morning from Florida, Clearwater specifically, is Dr. Bledar Prifti, who is an associate professor of political science at St. Petersburg College. Bledar, Eric, and Stephen, good morning to all three of you. Stephen, let me start with you. What do you make of the buildup in that region? Is war around the corner, do you think?
Now, there's about a week left until, less than a week left, until the inauguration of Joe Biden in office. And President Trump has been incoherent at best and completely erratic at worst. It seems to me that there's a very basic contradiction that marks Trump's policy. On the one hand, there are sanctions, new sanctions, which President Trump introduced. There's been saber rattling. There's been the assassination that you mentioned. There's been coordination with Israel against Iran. On the other hand, it's not clear to me that Trump is someone who has actually engaged in many military actions abroad. And it's not clear to me if there is a desire for regime change, especially given the chaos it would create in the region. So either I think there will be a kind of reduction of sanctions down the road, so to speak, a diplomatic policy introduced, and an integration of, or an attempt to integrate Iran into the world once again, or it will be the opposite. There'll be a tightening of sanctions, tightening of military, or heightening of military dangers, more ships in the area, more sabotage, and an attempt made at regime change. I think with the introduction of the Biden regime, it will be the former rather than the latter.
Bledar, if you can hear me, tell me what your thoughts are about whether or not Donald Trump may seek to start a violent confrontation before Joe Biden takes over.
It's not the case, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think that this kind of confrontation may not be mainly about the U.S.-Iran relationship. We also need to consider other actors as well. In this case, Israel. I think and I believe indeed that Iran is more of a threat to Israel. At least what Iran has been doing in the last 5 to 10 years has been kind of threatening Israel's interest in the region. And as we know, Israel is a very, close and strategic ally of the U.S. So I think that this confrontation is more about the Iran-Israeli relationship, in which Israel apparently sees its interest as being threatened by Iran's actions. And I look at this kind of scenario. I mean, this kind of relationship or situation, indeed, as being more about Iran-Israeli relationship, and the U.S. In this case is trying to maintain a balance. U.S. does not see any threat in Iran or Iran's actions. However, indirectly, Iran's actions are threatening Israel, and it is important for the U.S. to kind of prevent any disturbance of power in that region, especially when it comes to those two actors, Iran and Israel, because both historically and geostrategically, they tend to be kind of allies of the U.S., not enemies, indeed.
Stephen, what are your thoughts on those dynamics? I mean, it does make sense, of course, what Bledar is saying, right? That the Israelis would be the ones most concerned about Iran, and they've always expressed such concerns in the recent past as well. How much of an impact will that have even going forward for the Biden administration vis-a-vis policymaking towards Iran?
I think those were very insightful remarks, and I basically agree with this in a certain way. Israel is tightly aligned with the United States. It has a $40 billion aid package that will run another, I think, 6 or 7 years. And my only suggestion is that if Israel acts, it will be as a proxy for the United States. I don't think it's possible for Israel to launch a strike of this sort without clearance from the United States. The other point I'd like to make is, while it's quite correct to say that there is no objective threat that Iran poses to the United States, the propaganda speaks otherwise. The entire propaganda apparatus has been over the years targeting Iran as an imperialist nation, actually with a, if I can say so, targeting it as a rogue state with basically belligerent and, if not insane, leadership that is ready to throw a bomb, cast a bomb at any moment as soon as it achieves one. And that's part of the danger here, that the ideology will overtake the reality.
That's a very good point, isn't it, Bledar? Do you think that there is, to a very large extent, a lack of understanding, actually, of what Iran is about? I mean, I lived in Iran for about 13 years as a journalist, and there does seem to be this major disconnect about reality on the ground and what the rest of the world, especially what Americans, perceive of it.
Well, in this case, I view Iran's foreign policy as also being mixed with its domestic policy. And that's where the real problem, in my opinion, is. We need to kind of, especially those who study domestic, policy of Iran, they need to kind of see, how much is Iran's domestic policy is also influencing its foreign policy, because sometimes it may lead to some kind of irrational foreign policy. And I have a tendency to believe that Iran is kind of using its foreign policy to also promote its domestic policy. We need to kind of be aware of this, because we're talking about the regime in Iran. Basically, that regime needs to justify holding power. And one of the justifications is to have some enemies around, because a regime cannot survive without having some kind of, enemies from outside to protect power from within. So domestic policy in this case, plays an important role. And also we need to understand the fear of Israel. Israel has been having this fear for decades, since its, birth. But that fear was toward the Arabs. Now Iran has become the primary threat, at least in Israelis' eyes. Iran has become the main threat. And that's what, in my opinion, is causing all this situation, this kind of conflict between the U.S. and Iran is primarily about Israel. And I repeat this because that's how I see that. And the problem there also, I see that there is this, domestic policy of Iran that is interfering with its foreign policy. And that might be dangerous for Iran to begin with. Who knows, for the region as well.
Eric, if you can hear me, just tell me what are your thoughts on whether or not Iran is enough of a threat for the U.S. at this point in time to possibly launch some sort of a confrontation. I mean, it's hard to read anything else at this point about the military buildup, or maybe it's just defensive. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first on the Iranian side, I would say that the probabilities are low that it wants a confrontation. We've seen that it's throughout the campaign of maximum pressure against Iran. It's been practicing what's referred to as strategic patience, so trying to wait out the end of the Trump administration and then see what the Biden administration has to offer. Or it's also been practicing incremental resistance in terms of increasing the stakes through its proxies, through its missiles, precision, through seizing tankers, incremental resistance, but without wanting to trigger a conventional conflict against a foe that it knows it's conventionally inferior to. So I believe that that's the calculation on the Iranian side. And what we're seeing is that as with these recent escalations on the U.S. side, the Iranians are flexing their muscles, or what we refer to in international relations as an increased security dilemma, by conducting exercises with its drones, with its missiles, with its forces. And this is really just a show of force, but at the end, again, I really believe that Iran does not want a conventional conflict with the United States. On the flip side, and as was mentioned before, there's really a conflict here of policy, a conflicted policy on the U.S. Initially, President Trump campaigned on a promise to end conflicts in the Middle East, or at least reduce the U.S.'s military footprint. And we've seen that in terms of the troop sizes, with reducing American troops to 2,500 in Iraq and Afghanistan. And yet here we are at the brink of war with Iran in recent days and weeks, with an increased U.S. presence in the air, by sea. Really, to be honest, it's difficult to know what will happen in the next several days on the U.S. side, given the unpredictability of politics even here in the U.S. And so, even if the Trump administration does not want a conflict, there's also the risk of miscalculations and misperceptions on both sides, not to mention the actions of U.S. partners and allies in the region that could lead to a conflagration in the region. And so, at least for someone who wants to see stability in the region, we hope that cooler heads will prevail for the next several days until the Biden administration is inaugurated.
But Eric, I wonder if the Biden administration, once it does come into office, do you think that they'll really be able to walk into the Iran nuclear deal as they so want, as Biden has so declared? Because, all of the above, as you said, escalation on the part of the U.S. creates more mistrust on the Iranian side, doesn't it? So that makes it ever harder then to revive the nuclear deal?
I mean, I think it's as you said, it's not going to be straightforward to re-enter the deal. The Biden administration has expressed its willingness to do so, but as you said, they would have to overcome 4 years of mistrust, along with all the sanctions that the United States has imposed over the last 4 years, the designations against entities in Iran, as well as its partners and proxies in the region. I mean, recently designated the Houthis in Yemen. And there be, while some analysts will say it's just a swift waving of a pen through executive to eliminate the executive orders that the Trump administration had created to implement these designations and sanctions, it would be more complicated than that, beyond just building trust with the Iranians. And of course, there's different factions in Iran. We're also heading into a presidential election in Iran, where we may see the moderates step aside with a more hardline administration there. where it might be more difficult to engage the Iranians, but also in terms of now scaling back the 4 years of maximum pressure that the U.S. has imposed on Iran, would not just be with a magical wand or swift action of a pen on behalf of Biden. Even under the Obama administration, when the JCPOA was implemented, they still hadn't rolled back secondary sanctions, for example, against countries and companies that wanted to do business with Iran. So there's a lot to undo here. And the last thing is that who starts first in terms of with the JCPOA. The Biden administration has said that they want to re-engage Iran and re-enter the JCPOA, but they say that the Iran has to comply by scaling back its nuclear activities. And yet the Iranians would argue that it's the United States that has, since they withdrew from the agreement originally in 2018, it would be the United States that would have to take the first step by reducing sanctions. So there's also an issue there in terms of who first starts engaging in measures of compliance.
Very well. Yeah. So, Stephen, what are your thoughts on then the Iran nuclear deal right now going forward? Because for the Iranians, that is the most important factor in relations with the United States and for peace in the region as well.
Build on just one or 2 points that Eric raised. First of all, sanctions policy is probably the most complicated in international relations. One could do courses on sanctions leveled against any given country, and that's particularly the case with Iran. To pull back or to reduce sanctions will very much depend actually on how President Biden perceives domestic developments in Iran. Will the hardliners retain control in the next election, or won't they, basically? It's also the second part of the problem, I think, is there's a tremendous lack of clarity on both sides about the objective interests of the different countries. For Israel, as it was said before, I think Iran poses an existential threat, not far less a real one than the United States does. And to my mind, the difficulty is it's impossible it's very difficult to compromise on principles. Yeah. It's much more simple to compromise on objective interests, but those remain very unclear at the moment. We have a situation in which I think one shouldn't underestimate the role of ideology in shaping perceptions. It would seem to me that President Biden has made pretty clear that he wants to reestablish the nuclear accord. Granted, all the problems that Eric raised just before. The other thing, of course, is that I think it's unfortunate the way in which European interests in the nuclear deal are often underestimated. That, as Eric put it, there's a magic wand waved and Europe will somehow fall into line. That's not clear to me. So where does Biden stand? He stands, I think, at the moment, one, ready to re-engage Iran. Two, he is a president plagued with other issues, even more dramatic, such as North Korea. And thirdly, the domestic policies that, or the domestic situation in the United States will, I think, prove dominant. That is to say, COVID and the rehabilitation of the American economy.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as a final word, gentlemen, but we appreciate all three of you for your time early this morning and for taking your time out to share your expertise with us. I was Stephen speaking to us from New Jersey, Eric and Bledar are both speaking to us respectively from Florida. Viewers, we discussed there quite a few things when it comes to U.S.-Iran relations, but of course we started off by talking, as I said at the beginning of my introduction, about this military buildup very close to Iran by the United States, combat power in place there, the U.S. military increasing its firepower in that area. Is this all a lead up to some sort of confrontation? We have been here before where there's been talk a lot on the part of experts about confrontation between the Iranians and the Americans directly. There is the Israel factor, as Bledar mentioned a number of times, of course, in his answers, but it's beyond that, right? It's also about the sanctions. It's also about the Americans walking away from the nuclear deal. And yes, on the Iranian side, and the concerns about the Americans, the Americans have, I should say, about the Iranian regional activities, quote unquote, as perceived, proxies, etc. Those words are thrown around a lot, but it seems that there is that as well. As Stephen said, this war of perception and narratives as well about Iran has been created, and that's very difficult to move beyond such a situation. One, of course, hopes that cooler heads prevail on all sides. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a new poll that has come out of the U.S. talking about how 4 out of 5 Americans view the country as falling apart. Now, of course, polls are interesting, aren't they, where it's all about the definition and about the narrative and the understanding of the question and how people respond to it in different ways, considering their understanding of the respective question. Now, of course, this poll came right after the riot that took place at the Capitol Hill by Trump supporters. Was that, of course, something that affected this poll? Probably, certainly. It also shows an increase in respondents who did want Trump to be impeached. And we know, of course, at this point that Donald Trump has been impeached twice now during his tenure. Let me bring in our guests who are joining us to discuss this further. We're joined by Dr. Rashawn, who's a sociologist. He's a Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. this morning. Also joining us this morning from Charlotte, North Carolina, is Dr. Houck, who is an assistant professor of political science department at the Queen's University of Charlotte. Aaron and Rashawn, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Aaron, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this poll? 4 out of 5 Americans seeing the U.S. as falling apart is not a small number, is it?
So I think, good morning, or good afternoon. Political polarization has been something that has been on the increase in U.S. politics for decades now. The two main political parties are more ideologically distinct and distant from each other. And the voters are picking up on that. They see the big differences in the parties, the big differences between the supporters of the parties, and they feel that divide. I think that's what you're seeing reflected in the poll. I think U.S. voters and citizens and residents are concerned about the political future of the country. What we saw last week on Wednesday at the Capitol was very disheartening and scary. And so people are a little bit wary about the future.
Rashawn, what are your thoughts on that? Because, I would think that 4 out of 5 Americans, so many Americans saying that they are pessimistic about the country's direction, even though, for many of them, they should possibly be being more optimistic considering Joe Biden is coming to office. That still doesn't bode well, right, for the country.
Yeah, you're exactly right. This poll showing that 4 out of 5 Americans perceive that the country is falling apart. It speaks to our social institutions. It speaks to our failed social institutions, from our government to our healthcare system, to our economy, to the way that people participate in politics. Even though the political process this year, we saw more people vote than we've seen in the United States for over a century, and more people were able to participate in different ways. I think people are also speaking to the fractured way that the media operates, mainstream media, as well as the polarization on social media. So when we look at the major social institutions in America, coupled with the fact that hundreds of thousands of Americans have died from COVID-19, coupled with the fact that people are still not able to get the vaccine as bureaucracy and delays in states are preventing people from getting the vaccine that they desperately need. When people saw the Capitol coup, it was kind of the tip of the iceberg, where they viewed the Capitol as a symbol that should not be touched. I mean, it hasn't necessarily been like these outcomes haven't happened since like the War of 1812, when the United States was still aiming to separate from Great Britain. Now, of course, there have been various insurgencies over the years in the 50s, even more recently than that in the 80s, but nothing like this that we just saw. And I think what people are speaking to are problems with our social institutions. The Biden-Harris administration have an uphill battle to try to repair that.
All right, so let's talk about the Biden-Harris administration, Aaron. How optimistic should we be? How hopeful should we be? Because I would think that even if we look at the Obama tenure, he had a hard time bringing the country together. Do you think that Biden will do better?
I don't think that Biden will be able to heal the divisions in the country to the extent that needs to happen. The Republican Party has made a point of trying to oppose Democratic candidates and Democratic policies as much as they can. That's what they did during Obama's tenure. Going into government, Joe Biden has a weaker Democratic Congress than Obama did in January of 2009. He has just 50 Democratic senators in the U.S. Senate. He's going to need all of their votes to get things passed, and there are some conservative Democrats in the Senate who may frustrate some of those aims. And it's unlikely that he'll be able to get the support of many, if any, Republican senators on the policies he's trying to pass. There's no sign that Republican voters are going to give Biden even a honeymoon period, sometimes people talk about, for new presidents. Republican voters are very strongly opposed to all Democratic politicians, including Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I would expect that to persist from the get-go. You look at these same polls that show the country divided. It shows that majorities of Republicans don't think that Donald Trump did anything wrong when it came to last week's violence, that they think that, if anything, he hasn't gone far enough in fighting against the lie about election fraud. And so I would expect the divisions to continue and for the Biden administration to have a hard time getting their policies passed. There are going to be procedural ways they can get policies passed without needing large majorities, but Republicans are going to oppose them every step of the way.
Rashawn, there was a time, right, and it wasn't too long back, where Republicans and Democrats still respected each other publicly, and I'm talking about lawmakers and, of course, even just voters. I mean, there were always differences in opinion about policies, et cetera, domestic or foreign. But now it seems that that's less and less the reality, where there's less respect for each other. And I mean, I would put the Democrats in this as well, because there are times where it feels overwhelming sometimes, the way that even Republicans or conservatives, or however you want to term that, are spoken of sometimes, the narrative. That's never a good thing, right? That sort of rhetoric and division.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think it's a few things for people to recognize. I go to the Capitol quite often. I meet with our elected officials in the United States. I testify on bills often. And behind the scenes, conversations behind the scenes that I've seen that are oftentimes bipartisan, even meetings with Republicans talking about topics that a lot of their supporters will balk at, such as reparations for the descendants of Black Americans, are things that I see behind closed doors that don't translate to the front. And I think a lot of things that are happening in the United States politically is political theater. Now, I don't think this is anything new, but social media is new. So it allows for politicians to not have to wait for mainstream cable news to pick them up. Instead, they are able to directly translate to their supporters. And we've seen that with Donald Trump. I think the other thing that's key is that while, again, as I mentioned, Biden will have an uphill battle, I do think for 2 years that there's going to be a really big way for Democrats to be aggressive. If we go back to 2008, former President Barack Obama was really aiming to compromise with Republicans. And he quickly saw that that was something that he shouldn't have done. In particular, I think his judges selections, and we've seen the ramifications of that with Trump being able to select such a large number of judges that we haven't seen in decades, is going to be on the federal courts for decades to come. But even though that Democrats lost a few seats in the House, they still overwhelmingly have the majority. And then in the Senate, it's 50-50 after Warnock and Ossoff winning in Georgia. And Vice President-elect Kamala Harris controls the tiebreaker. I do think that Democrats are going to be able to get a lot of things done. In particular, Biden has already came out forcefully with the large stimulus bill for dealing with vaccinations, as well as for getting families the money they need. I think that's going to be a big sway, the same way that when Trump did it initially, that there were some Democrats who got on board with that. I also expect some of the changes he's made with the Department of Justice, some of the ways he's thought about the Department of Education will lead to a lot of changes in the United States. And I do think he'll get some conservative support.
So then, Aaron, it's interesting that Rashawn mentioned that. It makes complete sense, right? That behind the scenes, we have a lot of these lawmakers who bicker publicly that are actually trying to work together, right? Then who does this political theater, as Rashawn, if I may borrow his term, benefit? Because it's not benefiting the American people to see this political theater, is it?
So the politicians in Congress are worried about their next election. Whether that's a re-election campaign for their current office or it's an election for a higher office. And different politicians have different audiences that they're worried about for their upcoming election campaign. And if you're a Republican politician, the audience you're probably most interested in or worried about is your primary audience. So in the U.S., the parties have primary elections to select the party's candidate for then the general election. And in those primary elections, not everyone votes. It's a small subset of the electorate as a whole, and it's often very committed partisans who vote in those primaries. And so Republican politicians are worried about being primaried is a term that pundits sometimes use, and that someone to their right, a more conservative candidate, will come along and defeat them in the primary. They don't want that to happen, so they are very concerned about the far right elements of the Republican electorate so that they can win re-election via the primary. But another thing to note, though, is the new members that are coming in. And the Republican Party has some new members in the House of Representatives who are true believers. So there are some folks getting on the floor of Congress who now, I don't think it is political theater for them, when they're giving voice to some of these extreme comments and even giving voice to some of these conspiracy theories that have been bouncing around on the far right corners of the internet. They actually believe them. And so one thing that's important to note, and beyond the Capitol, if you look at state and local Republican elections and Republican parties, and this is sort of the minor leagues of the party, and it's where the future members of Congress will come from. You're also seeing a rise in far-right Republicans at the local level as well. So that's something to keep an eye on going forward.
Rashawn, I wonder maybe do you think it's overstated sometimes, these differences, or as in the differences in what they represent for division within the country and polarization? Because, I'm sitting in Texas right now, for example, you're sitting in D.C., and I imagine that the realities on the ground and the way voters in those respective places, in both these respective places, view things is quite different. That's natural, right, in a country as large as the U.S.?
Without a doubt. I mean, the United States is large, and Aaron just brought up some great points about new people who are coming in on the right and the left. And what it speaks to are fissures within the Republican and Democratic parties. In this regard, oftentimes moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans, where we might see a lot of potential for them working together, they are pulled to the fringes by progressives on one end and far right individuals on the other. The interesting thing about far right is that there is some conspiracies embedded within that. And we also have to think about the remnants of the Tea Party, which is still there. And then, of course, some of the far right extremism is also linked to white nationalism and white supremacy. So Republicans have a lot of issues within their party. And I mean, these fissures cause problems oftentimes for moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans which is why I'm really interested to look at the Biden-Harris administration. Because, I mean, look, by all respects, both of them are pretty moderate Democrats. I mean, of late, of course, Senator Harris has came out forcefully with some of these things. And as she becomes vice president, it'll be interesting to see whether or not she's going to double down on some of these progressive policies. But Biden's time in politics over the past 40 plus years shows that one thing he has been good at is being able to negotiate with people. I mean, we have to remember, even though Republicans come out and talk about they don't want the Affordable Care Act, that was one thing that was pushed through. And there was a little bit of momentum that allowed for that legislation to get through during the Obama Biden administration.
We'll have to leave as our final word, but we appreciate both Rashawn and Aaron for their time this morning, for sharing their thoughts on what Americans' view of their country is. 4 out of 5 saying their country is falling apart. That's not a very optimistic view, I should say, quite pessimistic, in fact. Is there good backing for such an argument that the country is falling apart? It is a war of perceptions, as both of our guests are also mentioned, and a war of political theater. But it's also about the reality of how voters feel in different respective places across the country. As I said, in Texas here, voters are increasingly conservative, while in places like New York or D.C., they're probably a lot less conservative as well. What does this mean for the U.S. going forward? What does this mean for the Biden administration, which is incoming at this point in time, vis-a-vis policymaking both within the country and beyond? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.